Hi friends, welcome to session number 6, the development of the Eucharist during the time of the spread of Christianity. In this chat, I'm going to try to give you an idea of the diversity that existed in early Christianity. I'm hoping if you can get a sense of that, you will appreciate who we are and what we believe is the result of thousands of years of different human experiences, struggles, conflicts, and ways that people have found hope and comfort. So here's a list of things that will help you review what we've learned and provide a focus as we move forward. At first, Jewish people understood Jesus from their very own cultural, religious, and historical perspectives. Then, in short order, Christians became missionaries, traveling throughout the whole known world to tell that Messiah had come. And then, when Christianity began to attract all sorts of people, Jewish adherents then had to decide if non-Jews, Gentiles, could be saved as well. Not everyone thought that they would, or they should. Christianity found itself in the middle of the Roman world. We refer to this as the Greco-Roman world because not only were they in the Roman world, they were in the Greek world as well. The term Greco-Roman refers to the peoples and countries whose lives and faith were influenced and changed by the language, traditions, government, and the beliefs of both ancient Greeks and Romans. Now, as you know, Romans were colonizers, and although Romans were very tolerant of other people's religions, they would not hesitate to use violence to keep others in line if they thought their government was being challenged. Treason meant death. Christianity was also impacted by what was happening with the Jewish community in the world. You may remember how the New Testament refers to Simon the Zealot. You find that in Matthew 10 and Mark chapter 3. Now, quite simply, Zealots were Jews who had strong beliefs about the purity of Judaism, and they deeply resented Roman control and interference. Now, to make a long story short, a series of revolts and battles resulted in the complete destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That happened in 70 AD. After that, any surviving Jews in Jerusalem had to leave the city. They were expelled from the city, and some of the Christians had to go as well. Now, from that point on, you see, Christianity had to separate itself from Judaism in order to survive. So it makes sense, doesn't it, that the development of the Eucharist might take a different road from that time on, from 70 AD. Getting back to the Jewish people being expelled from Jerusalem, it's a sad legacy, as you know, for Jewish people have suffered discrimination and persecution ever since. Another major change. On February 27th, in the year 380 in Thessalonica, the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius I signed a decree in the presence of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian II. And that made Christianity the religion of the state. That was a big change for Christianity because from that point on, Christianity gained an immense power and influence politically and in terms of religion. All of a sudden, instead of competing with all other religions and ideologies, you had to be a Christian. Now, think about this. you had Christianity growing in many different contexts. Hebrew language and tradition, Greek language and tradition, Latin language and tradition, which was Roman, and as the gospel spread, all sorts of dialects, different religious beliefs and customs. That was the environment for Christianity. So together, these things blended, challenged, corrupted, and formed the Christianity that is ours today. Now, in the midst of all of that, all these outside influences, Christianity was forming doctrine, establishing a biblical canon, developing ministries, baptizing people, worshiping, and gaining power. And you may remember me telling you that it was after 380, maybe a few years before, that Christians were actually now allowed to build churches. Buildings, that is. And I'll tell you one other thing. You don't need me to tell you that all Christians still don't agree. So here's a definition of an important word for you. Syncretism. Syncretism refers to the processes of amalgamation. The amalgamation of different cultural, legal, philosophical, geographical, linguistic, in other words, the language that was spoken, and religious practices. Sometimes the blending was gradual, other times it was forced on people through war or conquest. But by the end of the 2nd century, Christianity had spread throughout the whole known world. So it's safe to say that Christianity was influenced by these other cultures, but also by the time of the 2nd century, Christianity itself was strong enough to make itself an influence throughout the world. Syncretism meant the adapting of different religions and different beliefs, and Christianity was very, very much a religion that did that. Now, let's go back to our own church. I hope that from time to time when you enter your church building, you think about why things are located where they are and what the reasons are for doing things that we do in a certain way. Have you ever thought of a map of the world when you went to church? That's not as far-fetched as it might sound. After all, churches are meant to represent the presence of God in the world. North, south, east and west, and up and down. You may not know it, but in most church traditions, the altar is in the east end of the building, and churches are built with an east-west orientation. The west end, generally, is where the main entrance of your church is located. There's a symbolism to that. Pilgrims travel toward the east. Pilgrims come from the west to the east. Think about the wise men when they saw the Star of Bethlehem rising in the east, and they traveled toward it. Let's talk about the traditions of north and south in the church. Standing in the church, looking at the altar, the north would be on your left. We refer to the left side as the gospel side, or the evangelist side. And that represents the very first movements of Christianity to preach the gospel. The missionaries first preached the gospel in the north. So it's on the north side that we proclaim the word and the gospel through preaching in the pulpit. Now we know that none of the missionary work of the church would have ever happened without the story of the church's development and growth. A word for story is an epistle. So, in the liturgical traditions of Western Christianity, the epistle side provides that particular background and foundation. So that means this: when you're standing looking at the altar, the south side of the church is to your right looking ahead, and we call that the epistle side. And it's there that we place the lectern from which we read our scriptures. Now, when you look back at the altar, you will quickly notice that it is in the middle of the east end. Nothing in our church obscures the view of the altar. And what happens there on the Lord's table is a result of the proclamation and teaching of the word of the Lord. If you notice candles on the altar, the ones on the north end are called the gospel candle. The candle on the south is called the epistle candle. And when they are lit or extinguished, the gospel candle is never permitted to burn alone. East is very significant in Christian tradition. The very first Christians faced east when praying for a variety of reasons. First of all, it was because of the ancient Jewish custom of praying in the direction of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Secondly, Christians looked to the rising sun as a symbol of life and light. Like many things in the early church, that particular thing caused some confusion and required some explanation. For example, non-Christians thought that Christians worshiped the sun. Thirdly, ancient traditions held that Messiah would appear in the east when human time was going to end and Jesus was returning at the second coming. A scripture from Matthew chapter 24. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man. Today, we still bury people facing the east so that they are able to face the Son of God on their resurrection day and look and behold him face to face. Now let's talk about the traditions that were developing at the same time Eucharist was developing. Please keep in mind that each of the following traditions and communities that I'm about to talk about each contributed in their own way to the developing and practice of the Eucharist in their own time. Christianity started out rooted in Judaism as a modest group of everyday fishermen, local officials, townsfolk and laborers, and went on to becoming the driving force. These people keeping alive a small religious movement which eventually grew into a world religion. Women. The role of women as teachers and leaders and healers and witnesses in the early days of Christianity must not be underestimated. From the very beginning, Christianity spoke that everyone was equal under Christ, men and women, slaves and free, Jew and Gentile. We were all one in Christ. Women, therefore, from all stratas of society, were free to combine their wisdom and their skills and their wealth and their education to being present in communities to help the poor, to help the sick, to teach, and to love. Women were the developers and maintainers of house churches. House churches were the first places Christians would gather for the Lord's meal. Wandering charismatics. They were a handful in those days. Wandering charismatics were people who simply took it on themselves to travel and share their version of the gospel. Now, there's all kinds of stories of wandering charismatics who believe some pretty strange things. If you're interested, research them or have a chat with me sometime about that. We read from St. Paul that he had encountered people who came from Judea with a different kind of gospel message, and he wasn't too happy about it. But they drew people toward Christ. Let's not forget that. And in time, people like St. Paul were able to go back and to help these churches get on track. Again, we think of the church in Corinth. Next, the missionary movement. The best example of the early Christian missionary movement, perhaps, is looking at St. Paul's missionary journeys. St. Paul was traveling and preaching and teaching. Missionary journeys show that the church was taking shape in relation to community and evangelistic mission. And what I mean by that is that churches were now equipping people, disciples, and sending them out. And when they were being sent out, they had this orthodox understanding of what Christianity was. It was still very early, but their teaching was becoming unified. Early monks and monasteries and the Desert Fathers. In the early days of Christianity, there were some who were very unhappy with the direction Christianity was heading. Certainly after Christianity found favor with the Roman Empire and had lots of power and lots of wealth, a number of people just didn't feel good about that at all. And some of them believed that the return of Jesus was still in the near future. So they made vows to withdraw from the world. And their vows included obedience, silence, chastity, and self-sacrifice. These people headed out into the deserts of Egypt to seek solitude and to achieve perfect communion with God. Some of these people lived in caves for years on nothing but bread and water. And these desert fathers wrote. Some of their writings are absolutely beautiful and insightful. And in their writings we find forms of worship. This is what the result was of them drawing away from the world, And they were a great influence on the development of Christian thought and doctrine and forms of Eucharist and deep teaching around Holy Communion. I also need to mention the Great Schism, because it marks a point where one part of Christianity began to form liturgy, Eucharist, a certain way, and this group over here did it a different way. On July 16th, in the year 1054, debates and disagreements between the Roman Church, based in Rome, and the Byzantine Church, based in Constantinople, led to a formal split. They began to excommunicate each other. That's how bad it got. And since that time, there has been the Western Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. These disagreements were complicated. They were political and theological. So let me just say this. The Great Schism came about due to a complex mix of religious disagreements and political conflicts. There were disagreements about the Eucharist. The main question being whether or not it was okay to use unleavened bread for the sacrament of communion. The West said, yes, of course it is. And the East said, no, absolutely not. Other objects of dispute included the exact wording of the Nicene Creed and disagreements over the Western influence that priests were to remain celibate. They could not marry. The Eastern Church didn't really have a problem with that. Now, all of that I've just shared is just a breeze blowing by. There's enough material there, though, as you can see, for several lectures. If you're interested in learning more, do an internet search for the word filioque, and that will keep you busy for a while. To this day, the two churches have never reunited. We're learning how to get along, but we have never been reunited. Here's my point. That Eucharistic prayers from the East and the West, after that point, both took on distinctive characteristics. Beauty in both traditions, but very, very different in the actual practice of worship. If you ever do have the opportunity to attend an Eastern Eucharist or liturgy, I would encourage you to do so if you are invited. Very long, very elaborate, very musical, very busy, and very beautiful. Us Anglicans like to be in and out in less than an hour. Here's a conclusion. What I really hope you get a sense of now is the diversity of Christian traditions. Please don't try to think of Christianity as a straight line. Try to envision the image of Jesus saying, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of people." Think about that diversity that existed all over the known world, and how from generation to generation these traditions, like fish in a net, were being gathered into one place. I want you to realize that there are dozens and dozens of Eucharistic prayers written, and these prayers reflect different times, different experiences, different understandings. They have to. And you could devote a whole lifetime to studying them. Here's the point of that. In spite of all the differences and the diversity, they've been brought together for us by one Spirit. That, in my heart, is a miracle. One that I'm not surprised about, but thankful for. So now that we've reached this point, knowing that we've only touched the tip of the iceberg, we're almost ready to look at our own Eucharists. We're almost ready to discover those important fundamental things that exist wherever you are in the world and whatever tradition you are worshiping in. But because we're Anglicans, before we do that, in our next chat, we're going to need to jump ahead in time to speak about the Reformation and our own Book of Common Prayer. See you soon.